Welcome to the Spirit of Business, episode number 77, Business as a Sacred Activity, with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Matt. I've got a topic that I want to bring up that follows on from what we were talking about last week. Because last week we ran through 5 questions, like deeper questions that we figured would have an impact on the way that we do business. And we never really got to the point of looking at the consequences. And the questions, I'm going to run through them just as a reminder, and for anyone who didn't hear the last one, because I think there's an interesting sequel to this. So the questions were, who am I? Where am I? What am I? Why am I here? What am I doing about it? And what do I want? So they're kind of deep questions. They're not like, who am I? I'm a teacher. Where am I? I'm at school kind of thing. They're more like, who am I as a human being? What does it even mean to be human? Kind of deeper questions. And the thing that came out that I described in last week's podcast for me was around joy, and that why I'm here is very much connected with joy. And then yesterday morning, I woke up early in the morning. By early, I mean too early, earlier than I wanted to be. I don't know what the time was, but and I had a lot that needed to be done yesterday, and I was feeling that kind of pressure. You know, it wasn't horrible pressure. It was just pressure like, I've got a lot to do, and I don't know if I'm going to get it done in time, and I don't want it to hang over till the next day, and all that sort of stuff just going around in my mind. And I could have spent a bit of time thinking about how to organize myself properly and all of that, but I just found myself, perhaps in the vein of last week's podcast, looking for a better solution. I felt like I don't want to keep coming back here. I want a solution that actually solves this, because I don't like to feel that kind of pressure. And the reason that was so clear to me was that the reason that most business owners that I see don't experience that much joy is because of the pressure they feel. It's like, I can enjoy pressure even. I can enjoy the rush of things, and I can enjoy having a lot to do. But joy itself, which is what was my answer to those questions, is a deeper thing, and it gets really suppressed by that kind of pressure of just stuff to do. You have to keep your head down, you have to have it all written on a list, you have to get through it, that kind of thing. And so I was lying in bed and just like, oh, where's a deeper question? What's going to solve this for me? And this question just placed itself in my mind. And I don't know how you'll react to this question, so I'm going to tell a bit more of the story as well. The question was, what if business is a sacred activity? And for me, that immediately meant something, because I do tend to see that life itself is sacred, that nature is sacred, not in a religious sense. I'm not a very holy person, I don't think, but just in this sense of it being something that it has a kind of preciousness and a kind of energy around it where it's almost beyond words. There's something about it that deserves our wonder and our awe and our deep respect. It's not just something to be thrown around like a football, you know? And then again, so what happened after that was this morning, there were a whole lot of financial issues that I needed to look at and deal with. And I was sitting there thinking, okay, how am I going to do this? It was early in the morning, I was with my husband, and I just found myself again saying, what would be a way of doing this that doesn't lead to difficult conversations? I could see all these difficult conversations coming up. It's like, I don't want to have those kinds of conversations. They usually result in compromises, and I don't like compromises. So I again just said, like, what's a better way of looking at this? And I got the same thing. It was like, what if doing business is a sacred activity? And I started to feel into it. And literally within a few seconds, it was like the big grin opening up inside me. Probably that's the best way to describe it. I just suddenly felt like, oh my goodness, if I really understood that doing business is a sacred activity, there are a whole lot of things that I would do differently. And in the there was a time, I don't know if it still happens, but in Islam, where they had special priests, and this is a religious solution, they had special priests whose job was to maintain the sacredness of commerce. And they would literally operate in the marketplaces to keep commerce sacred. Now, I don't think it's necessary to, this can be religious or not religious. It's not necessary to make it one way or the other. So for somebody who's religious, I think you can think about business this way, and somebody who's not. But I really would like to explore with you what would happen if we thought about business as a sacred activity. And it seems almost like heresy these days, because we just have this thing like, oh, commerce is somehow, even if you really are into business, there's always this feeling that maybe it's dirty, or maybe it's so material. It's got very divorced, I think, from the sacred, and that doesn't feel right to me. So I'm very curious how you respond to my little monologue.
Well, I probably had about, I don't know, 1,000 thoughts that went through my head when you were talking. So I'm going
That's
to
a good
try and
start.
remember all those. I'm going to remember all those thoughts if I can, and then try and address them. So the word sacred, I didn't really connect with, I've got to say, when you said it. It wasn't a word that I naturally go, oh, sacred. But then I started to listen to you and think deeper about it. And then I started to think about the word or the thought of being in the inner sanctum, right? So, and maybe this is worth asking the question for you. When you think of sacred, do you think that there's an inner sanctum of being sacred? So sacred is kind of like the outer layer of something, and then you've got something inside of it, if that kind of makes any sense. And so for me, if I think of business in that light, I think it's a precious thing, because you use the word precious as well. And I think, okay, if we're treating it as something that's precious, then we're treating it with more respect. And you said that as well. It's precious. There's respect associated with it. Sometimes you said about discarding it, so we don't discard it. And so all these things started to come through my mind. And then you also said that we can see it as being dirty, and the ugly side of it as well, and compromise, and all the things that we don't love about being in business. And how do we change our mindset? So really what I'm hearing is that, can we change our mindset from some of the wiring that we've had about business that's either been there from other people coming towards us, or been there internally for us to say that we think of it of a different way? Because I still think of business, I love the purity of it. So that's part of the sacred part of it. There's a pureness associated with business, and it comes back to core principles. So, we were choosing subjects for my son last night about what to do in year 11 and year 12. And we were talking about the different subjects. And one of them, he was looking at to work out whether he wants to do economics. And so we looked at the brief of what economics is. And economics, really, the foundation piece of economics is the law of demand and supply. Okay, so you have a demand for something and you'll supply it. And the perfect market is when demand meets supply. That's effectively how it works. Now, I see that as a purity. Okay, now that could also be saying that there's maybe, from your words, that could form part of that. So then I think about all these things. I see business as pure, and I see it's based on some pure foundations, and therefore we need to then, as people, the purity gets compromised because of the complexity. And because of the complexity of what we're doing, that creates all the difficulty, and the difficulty can create all of the angst and the pain that goes along with business. So I was kind of taking it from that pure sense all the way through to why do we feel the way we do about it some days? And then how do we get back to that pure place? Is this making any sense on sort of unpacking what you're saying, looking at it from a completely different angle?
It's really interesting to hear you talk about business in those terms, and to use a word like purity in relation to it, because probably a lot of people wouldn't associate it. Now, you've obviously had a unique view inside so many businesses, and so that helps you to see the principles of it. And that gives you a very different perspective. The way that I'm going to come back to the word sacred because I think some people will have quite strong reactions against it. I've mentioned it to two people today who are both grew up as Catholics, and they both said, "Oh, I don't like the word sacred." And then I remember, "Oh, the Sacred Heart and the sacred everything's sacred," but probably
The
didn't.
sacristy and all that sort of stuff
Yeah,
as
yeah,
well.
and it might not have felt really. You might not have really felt that sacredness there.
No.
Um, but then I just thought, so what are the things that we feel, and everybody will have something different. What do you feel is really sacred in your life? What is it that has that quality about it where there's a sense of honor and even awe? And maybe it's your children, maybe it's what is it? I'm sure everyone has something that
It's
feels really
interesting going
sacred.
back to those questions because I just made a connection there. The questions, the first one, who am I? And in the last podcast, I spoke about what kept coming back up for me is the simple bloke syndrome, feeling like I'm just this simple bloke who's learning stuff and teaching and navigating through life, and that create. And I practiced that all this particular week, in terms of coming back to that particular point. But I think simple and I think pure. And you spoke about children, and I think when a baby's born, I always think that it's absolutely the most pure being when it comes out because it's kind of influenced by the environment at that particular point in time. So, and then I think about the word simple, and I think I connect simple with pure. So I connect all these things together. And so, and then I spoke about business and the pure market between demand and supply. So I'm making all these connections personally, but then also how that all works from a business point of view and the purity of it. But the word that keeps sticking to me is what you said about compromise. And that's the thing you said, I don't like compromise. And I said, and I know that feeling because I was saying this to one of my, colleagues the other day. I said, I feel like I constantly compromise all day, every day, but not for my benefit, for the benefit of others. So therefore,
There's a double
that doesn't
compromise.
feel good. Yeah. And so therefore, that's part of this. And that's probably why business doesn't feel great. A lot of the time, you feel like you're constantly compromising, but not in a positive way, but in a giving too much away perspective. So
I don't think
yeah,
compromises
that's
ever feels good. It's not. I really don't like compromising. So, this is what happened for me when I started thinking about business as a sacred activity. Was that there were some conversations I was thinking about that I wasn't looking forward to, and that I thought might get tense and might get difficult. And those are the kind of conversations where it's easy to lead to compromise. And I just started to ask myself, so how would you approach that, whatever the topic is? How would you approach it if you saw business as a sacred activity? And what solution would you come up with? So when we get into a difficult relationship, let's say, somebody's let you down in business, or we have a problem at the moment with our tractor, and it overheated, and now the manufacturer, whose name I will politely not mention at the moment, but they're trying to say that it doesn't count under the warranty. It was only a few months old and had only done 30 hours of work, and they're trying to blame it on us. And that's an ugly kind of situation to be in. And I was thinking, supposing both we and the manufacturers would approach this as a sacred activity, we would come out with a really different solution from if we approach it as something where they're basically, as far as I can see, and as far as our local salespeople appear to be saying, that they're trying to get away with something that I don't think that they should get away with. Like, you would never do that if you felt that this was something that your business and how you behave in business is a really precious, honorable activity. You just wouldn't do that.
and that's the point. That was the word that I was thinking. You just use the word honorable, right? I'm thinking, how does this actually, if what you're trying to explain there, because I'm trying to work out how the sacredness of business works and what that actually means. And I was sitting there saying, what if they've got two people that are coming together and one's trying to lay the blame on the other person to get an unfair advantage, which is compromised to its negative sense, like we spoke about before. I thought, well, what's the opposite to that? Well, it's actually being honorable. And typically when you have been sacred, you're honoring something. You're honoring the simplicity or whatever that you actually believe is sacred. And if business is sacred, you approach it from the perspective of honoring it and therefore being honorable in your approach.
Yeah, though it's interesting. I definitely agree with you that honor is a part of it, and at the same time, honor is a part of some very old-fashioned systems where people used to stick swords through each other and do it for the sake of some damsel in a pretty dishonorable way, I think. So there's
Yeah.
kind of honor. There's the kind of old-fashioned masculine honor, which probably is not that honorable, really.
No.
But I definitely agree with you that honor is a part of it. For me, when something's sacred, I think the easiest thing to relate to for me is nature.
Mhm.
If I look out at the trees and the birds, and there's something about all of that is really beyond words, and it touches somewhere inside us. It touches the soul, or it touches our spirit, or it touches that part of us inside that is difficult to speak about, but it's there, and it's a very different kind of connection from anything that you can make just by describing things with your mind and making rational decisions. And I feel that that's the thing that I was, when those questions landed in my mind, it was like I was really being invited to feel that around business, that this is really an extraordinarily beautiful activity, which is a contribution to life. And it is genuinely precious. Every element of it is precious. It's as precious as a baby, as a newborn baby.
So you're talking about how you approach it, because we can approach business in a way that's like, oh, it's very heavy and it's hard and it's, difficult and that sort of stuff. Or you can approach it in a way that's light and enjoyable, or you can approach it in a way that's spiritual or it's honorable, like we spoke about. And so I like this concept and I get your point about the negative aspect of honor, but you're honoring the privilege of being able to do something, okay, in business, which actually, if you approach it from that perspective, would feel good in the day, as opposed to coming into the day or coming into the week or the month or the year feeling like, oh, it's another year, it's painful, I don't want to do this anymore, or I've got all these difficult questions or decisions to make or whatever it is. So it's a way that I see that you're approaching business. And if you actually say it's a precious thing as opposed to a thing that's not precious, then you approach it in a different manner. If you approach it in a different manner, it feels better. Is that kind of what I'm hearing from you?
Sort of. It's really interesting to have this conversation because I think it's a word I relate to very easily, funnily enough. And I see, like, if you think of the way that indigenous people experience nature, they know in their bones, they don't have to think nature is sacred. They know in their bones the sacredness of nature. With every breath of who they are, the relationship that they have with Mother Earth, like Earth really is a mother, is alive to them. And they have such deep respect for Earth that words like respect and honor aren't enough for it. And to me, that's what sacredness points to. It's where our language isn't enough for the my language isn't enough. Like, I can't find the words even, because it's something beyond. And I feel it. I can feel it in my heart. I can feel it kind of inside myself. There's a tenderness in there. And I think of somebody who's staying with us at the moment, and the other day a tiny little bird crashed into the glass of one of our windows and fell down, and I just saw the way she was watching it. It just jumped up onto something afterwards, and there was this sense in her of this, like, there's this little tiny bird, and there wasn't much she could do for it, but a kind of care and love for this little thing. And my husband, if he finds a bird that's injured or something, he picks it up in his hands so gently, and he kind of just strokes it and just like talks to it. And very often after a little while they'll just fly away, but there's this kind of sweetness and it's much deeper than respect and honor, even though those are a part of it. There's this sense of it being something very, very special. And it's that. And the other thing that feels really, that comes to me is that it makes business and doing business part of nature. You know, we're part of nature. We're not separate from it. And if we saw business as sacred, we would look differently. We would do it differently. We wouldn't just, like I heard a crazy example the other day of a business that is cutting down something like 300 acres of trees, of native forest, in order to build a solar farm. It's like, what?
Madness.
How do you compute that?
Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense at all. And I think that if you saw business as a sacred activity, you'd have to think about the consequences of what you're doing. Does it make sense to cut down 300 acres of forest to make a solar farm? Like, you couldn't do it, even if it profitably it made sense. It doesn't make sense in the sense of life.
So there's an ethical requirement, a moral requirement. I'm not going to try and describe it anymore because it sounds like I'm using words that don't necessarily resonate.
Well, they're all part of it. It's just the words, none of the words really speak to the experience. I think that's the point. They point to it, but they're not, you have to experience it.
And then if you get down to the practicalities of what you're talking about, you and I might honor it, and you and I might think it's sacred, and we approach business from that particular way, and hopefully that influences other people to feel the same way. But going into the practicalities of the difficult situations or the difficult conversations you might be having on that day, like you spoke about, you wake up in the morning, you thought about, okay, I'm going to approach it in a different light, in a different way, which feels a lot better. Okay. But you're still dealing with a person who may not be on the same page as you or completely aligned with you. And therefore, it still might potentially drag, and I experience this, that where it can drag you into their world of misalignment to your world. And therefore, you don't feel good anymore because you're in a different space than what you were before and when you were feeling pure about what you were talking about. So how do you deal with that scenario?
Well, I always remember that I'm an educator. I think that's how I always deal with that kind of scenario when other people don't understand something that feels really important to me. I just remember, okay, Sarah, you're an educator. It's your job to share with people what you can that you think is beneficial to them, and don't expect everybody to understand you already. Otherwise, I would have broken my heart a long time ago. Because as you were speaking, I thought of those people who stand in the front of bulldozers when forests are being ripped apart. And their heart, their soul is so much with the trees and with nature. And it's like breaking their heart to see what's happening, because they understand the sacredness of life. And the people in the bulldozers don't.
And
Or
so
they've
therefore
switched
they
off.
feel it.
They've switched off
And so
from it.
therefore, how hard is it for them though? They're on one side, like you say, you've got the businesses that are bulldozing, and then you've got the people that are protecting the trees. And at some point in time, somebody's gonna, in that situation, compromise, win or lose, or whatever we talk about in terms of those terms. But we're always, we talk about businesses always trying to get, or in anything we do, that everybody benefits or everybody wins from the situation or everybody walks away feeling good about it. And that's always the goal, I think, of most honorable people will always try to conduct themselves in that way. And then you have a movement of people that aren't like that are always trying to take the unfair advantage and win at all costs and cause somebody else some pain. So we come across this stuff all day, every day, because not everybody feels that sense of honor to do the right thing. And this is and I find that the fatiguing part, when there's this unfairness that creeps into the world where there is no logic around the fairness aspect of it, which causes that real tension with what you're talking about, approaching business from a sacred sense as opposed to as a vehicle to destroy or destruct or to manipulate or to do all those other things.
So this for me is really interesting territory because I think in the past we've allowed a lot of quite destructive tendencies to become very strong in business. And I feel, and people might not agree with me, I feel that we're at a point where we have to admit that that's not okay. And that to do business, whether it's, large scale, huge companies, or small companies, but to do business in a way where we know that it's destructive to environments or to people for the sake of profit. Like, this is where the purity of business is really interesting, because nobody wants to have lots of regulations and kind of like, oh, you can't do this and you can't do that. People love the freedom of business in a way, and the purity of the market that you were talking about. And at the same time, as a species living on this planet, we have to look at the consequences of what we do. And so this is where the sacredness thing comes in for me, because it makes me want to look at those consequences. It makes it joyful even and pleasurable to do business in a way that is respectful of life and really values life, and to make decisions based on that. Now, that's not easy if somebody's employed in a company that is actually very destructive or has very bad habits. That's a really unpleasant place to be. But we're mostly talking here with business owners, and they have more freedom. To me, I feel that there's a kind of inner imperative for us to look at what is real value in human society, and to be willing to question things that we've valued in the past, where perhaps what we've valued actually is directly destructive to somebody else's environment. I don't think that it is sustainable for us at all to carry on without doing that.
So why are people motivated to be like that?
My instant answer is pain.
Mm-hmm.
I actually feel that when people are in pain, they're mostly motivated to do what they can to alleviate their pain or to distract themselves from their pain. So they don't actually, maybe it's almost like when you're really in pain, you don't have the bandwidth to...
So the obvious thing for me is that to gain an unfair advantage, which is kind of some of the thing that we're talking about there, to be able to make money. Okay, so therefore they're able to make profit and make money by doing something, no matter at the cost of which they're doing that. So therefore, the pain that you might be talking about is in a concept of poverty, that they're trying to reduce their, they want that financial security. So they're moving away from sort of something where it's not secure to something that's secure. So that's the pain bit there that's driving towards a particular thing.
But I don't think that poverty is probably the major driver. If you think how many people who are not poor at all also take advantage financially to make more. You don't have to be poor to be in that position. You can also be extremely...
No, and I don't mean poverty in the sense of somebody who's, in destitute poor. I'm talking about the concept of wanting to make money. Okay, so therefore they're moving away from a place that they're currently at the moment with a certain level of money that they've got and a certain amount of wealth towards something that gives them greater wealth. And so there's obviously something that they're unhappy about
something
at
missing.
That particular level that they want to then try and fix that pain or whatever to get more.
Well, if you look at human behavior, when we're in pain, let's say, especially if we're in mental or emotional pain, or like pain about who we are or what we're doing here, or all of those kinds of things, if you think about it, people will usually, they'll either try to fill that hole with some kind of relationship, something, a person, or they'll try to fill the hole with money or things. Men do it with fancy cars and whatever it is, traditionally at least. And I don't know, that's a terrible
There's
stereotype.
a sexist, such a sexist
Very
statement, but
sexist
anyway.
statement, but it does happen. Whatever it is, that we look for things to fill that gap, to where we feel there's some inner pain. This is what I see. People experience inner pain, and they'll either try to escape from it, and so some people escape from it by drinking and doing all different kinds of things, or we'll try to sort of cover it up, fill it up with things that we think will make us feel better. And we know that on the whole, having more money doesn't necessarily make you feel better. It doesn't make it right or wrong. It just, once you've got a certain level, it doesn't seem to make much difference to how people feel. But I think I heard a really interesting conversation recently. Somebody who knows quite a lot about some of the exceptionally powerful families in the world. And he said that in almost all of them, they had lost a child. And usually it was the child that they expected to inherit the empire, so to speak. And usually the next child was deemed to be in some way deficient. So they actually had a problem. And you know, I listened to it and I thought, oh my goodness, there is such pain there that perhaps it's really, really hard. You know, when you have that much pain and incomprehension, why did life do that to me, for example? If you don't, you know, if you lose a child and you don't have a way of understanding it, and it feels that life is against you, how do you behave then? You probably behave against life. You know, it's one and the same thing. So I actually think that that's the reason why people do it. And perhaps that's why I feel like if we can, I don't feel that life is against me. And I know that it's better to feel like that than it is to feel that life is against you.
So one of the things that we've been exploring lately in your business and our business is around this concept of integral accounting.
Yeah.
Okay. So where I'm sort of thinking about is that, you know, there's a balance. So in business, there's a balance between so many different things rather than just being focused on one thing, which could be at the detriment of another thing. So therefore, if you're making lots of money, but you're destroying the environment at the same time, there's a quid pro quo associated with that aspect.
Yes.
And so therefore, this concept that you've been talking about in business is around the integral accounting, and it has elements of that. I wouldn't mind you touching upon that, because I think there is what we're talking about with the sacred of business, and there is actually, for want of a better word, a formula that goes along with that to then demonstrate how we actually, and I think that there's a word that balance comes into that as well, an alignment. Because when you were talking about before that it goes beyond words, and you're speaking about the indigenous community, thinking about earth, there's this deep alignment where it's a part of it. It becomes a part of you. Okay. So then words don't describe it. There's an alignment. So there's a balance, right? And then when I'm thinking about balance, I'm thinking about this integral accounting concept that has, I think you said 6 elements associated with it. And I think, well, is that a way of making sure that we're focusing on a business being sacred by making sure it's in balance with all these particular things? So maybe it's worthwhile just touching upon those 6 elements, but then I'd like to follow that up with the next podcast where we actually talk about those 6 elements, if that's possible.
Yeah, interesting. So I learned about integral accounting from a guy called Dr. David Martin, who runs a course called Integral Wealth Management, I think, something like that. It was actually, I learned about it in terms of portfolio management, but I wanted to learn about it because I'm interested in the principles of money. And he described 6 elements to this integral accounting system, and he's been running investment portfolios on that for many years, very successfully. And he says that you need to have each of those 6 elements in your portfolio. So I applied it in our business in order to create something that feels good. This is the interesting thing for me. He said that if any of these elements is lacking, or is out of balance, you don't feel good anymore. So how you feel becomes a kind of indicator that there's something wrong with the way you do it. And the 6 elements that he describes, the first one he calls commodity. We translated the language a little bit in our business when we talk about energy. It's like the raw resources that form that business, or the portfolio of commodities are pretty obvious in a portfolio sense. The next one that he talked about, he describes as custom and culture, and we describe as culture and stories. It's like all the stories in a portfolio, it's media. It's the storytelling mechanisms of society and the cultural mechanisms of society. So it would include art and media and all those kinds of things. In business, we found that it was really interesting to start looking at all the stories in the business, because they form the culture of the business. And so, for example, just to have the raw energy, the raw commodity, so to speak, but not to have any culture is empty. You don't have that. If you just have money but you never pay attention to the culture of a business, you're describing so little of what goes on. It's actually a very poor way of accounting for things just in money. So that's the second one. The third one is knowledge, which is fairly easy to understand, and is a bit different from culture and stories for me. Knowledge is kind of formulated. And I started to look at it in terms of assets. It also very much connects with education, obviously, because once you have knowledge, you can educate other people. Whereas stories might be a part of education, they're not education in their own right. And then that's 3. The fourth one is money. And it's actually very interesting when you start to spell it out, which we can do in the next podcast. The 5th one is technology, which is the ways that we can gain leverage, really, the ways that we can multiply what we're capable of doing through using technology. And then the 6th one is well-being. And so what he's saying is that if, for example, if you apply it in a business field, if you have a weakness in your technology area, that's actually going to stress the whole business, the whole system, which I think is easy to relate to. Or if there's a lack of knowledge, for example, or if there's a lot of knowledge, but none of it, like in my business, if we didn't use technology to be able to present the knowledge to people, it would be very clumsy. We'd have to do it all ourselves, but we can bring that knowledge and the technology together in order to make the business work really well. So what I found is I'd just done the course with David Martin, and then I just really wanted to explore it. So I just said, okay, let's do a series of meetings and see what this looks like. I found it really enlightening in terms of business. It made me feel very different about the business, and what it did for me, and I think this does come to the sacredness, it actually made me see the richness in the business. Not just the money's a part of it, but I saw the richness, so the true wealth of the business. And then you start to come to words like abundance. You see the abundance in the business, and then we come to nature. Abundance for me takes me immediately to nature and the abundance of nature, and then we come back to the sacredness of life. And then we realize that business is a part of that sacred thing called life, which human beings are a part of. And so, yes, thank you. You took me by surprise there and brought us full circle.
I did. I sort of just had that thought process because I could start to see how we could possibly, I was just connecting things together from different conversations. And I thought, oh, hang on a minute. Is this exactly what we're talking about here? Is this responsibility around balance of all the things that we need to think about in business, which is kind of the purity of it. So we're not weighted in one area at the detriment of another area. And that's why I started to think maybe this is how we need to get the outcome of a sacred business, by focusing on each element of it to ensure that nothing falls out of balance where it doesn't feel good. And hopefully I wasn't distracting you by a completely different concept to it, but it feels like it connected well together.
Yes, and then it brings me back, because when you said supply and demand at the beginning, I was thinking it's interesting. There's something in there that I wanted to question, and I couldn't. But if you think about it, if you think at the moment how supply is influenced by marketing, And so people can feel crazy that they need something because they have some fear of missing out, for example, or because they've just been made to believe that they need this thing, whether they need it or not. You realize that supply and demand isn't as pure as it looks. So when you start to bring in these different elements and you bring well-being into it, for example, and you bring stories and culture into it, like those stories of manipulative marketing don't actually make us feel good. And so you start to be able to look at your different elements and see how you feel about them as well. And then the business, I think, really comes alive because you can count things. It's an accounting system. You can have feelings also about what you're accounting for. And then once you have that, you can start to make decisions that are richly informed decisions. And there's a kind of beautiful, rich purity perhaps in there, because it just feels to me like there's an alignment with life.
Well, I think that's just been an amazing conversation. Started off with talking about this word that came to mind, and then where we ended up in terms of trying to describe it as best as we possibly can, because as you say, it's beyond words, some of this, and so therefore, which is a hard element to talk about, especially in a podcast, if you can't describe it, I think, at the end of the day. But I think we've done a good job of probably pulling that together to make some sort of sense of what you're talking about there. And really going back to your point, which is the previous podcast around what do you want? You said, I want to feel joy. Okay. Running a business that has the elements of the integral accounting system, as you're talking about, the 6 elements that are all in flow together, would feel joyful. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And so therefore it kind of comes back full circle. We're talking about the who, where, why, what, and what questions that's gone into this outcome of, approaching business in being sacred. And then how do you approach business in a sacred way, where you're kind of coming from a balanced perspective and making sure that there's an integral aspect of it that has, a purity associated with it.
Because integral also means whole. So it brings that sense of wholeness into it, which also brings you back to a sense of sacredness. You experience the whole of something, not just the little parts. Well, that's very beautiful, Matt.
That is, and it has integrity too, which is great.
Yeah. Well, we've got all the bows on the boxes now around the sacredness of business. It's definitely going to influence me, this way of thinking. It'll be interesting to see whether other people struggle with the word, but for me, it touches something so directly, it immediately makes any business problem solvable if I think about it as a sacred activity.
Well, thank you for sharing that thought this week, and it's been a pleasure to unpack it with you once again, so thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Matt. You've been listening to The Spirit of Business with Matt Murphy and Sarah McCrum. If you'd like some insight into the spirit in which you do business, a great place to start is by looking at your relationship with money. Find out more by taking the Money Scorecard at moneyscorecard.app, and we'll be back next week.